So I'm really excited to be here today to share with you some findings on a study that I did that looked at, what do people who inject drugs think about the risks and benefits associated with participation in a mobile health study of polydrug use. And my interest in this, I'm going to borrow from Shira, who gave you some really nice introduction on who she was. My interest in this stemmed from having done a mobile diary study with female sex workers in which we asked them about their sexual lives over the course of a month, twice a day. And through the course of that study, we saw quantitatively we heard from people that they felt like a sense of empowerment, that they were feeling stronger, that they were starting to have more self-efficacy. And so those were some of the benefits that I was interested in studying systematically, because to date, there aren't a good set of ethical guidelines for how to conduct this kind of research, despite the fact that it's a burgeoning field. So that prompted my interest in this study as I thought about the work that I intended to do, which was with injection drug users. So I'd like to start by thanking my participants, my collaborators at University of California, San Diego, as well at Prevention Point, Philadelphia, and then the three sources of funding for this grant. So just as a bit of background, and Sarah and Brenda both did a great job teeing up what mHealth research is, but it leverages the increasingly sophisticated capabilities of mobile devices for measurement and intervention in health research, and as well as the delivery of health care. It's a new field of inquiry. The first RCT was published in 2004, and since then, research around mobile health has taken off exponentially. However, the harms and benefits of using mHealth approaches to study sensitive topics have yet to be systematically and comprehensively assessed from an empirical ethics framework. And as a relatively new field of inquiry, we've yet to articulate the best practice guidelines for protecting human subjects, and such guidelines are particularly salient when we're working with vulnerable and hidden populations around stigmatized and also illegal behaviors, including injection drug use. So specific human subjects concerns that might be unique to mHealth studies as opposed to other social science studies include the theft of mobile devices and the possibility of stigmatization if someone becomes aware of how the participant is using the device. mHealth protocols are often more burdensome than other types of social scientific methods. For example, the behavioral assessments can be required 2 to 5 times per day. Participants may receive cues to respond either at random or pre-specified and other inconvenient times. And then because of the level of engagement that's required, ML studies tend to provide fairly generous compensation with a combination of payment for data entry, personal use of the mobile device, and or an ability to retain the device upon successful completion of the study. And so then from an ethics perspective, it's critical to assess whether the compensation structures allow economically marginalized populations to provide voluntary and uncoerced consent, and to understand any potentially beneficial or harmful experiences that could be associated with participation in an mHealth study. So the purpose of this study was to contribute to the empirical base of mHealth research by exploring participant perspectives on the potential risks and harms associated with participation in a hypothetical mHealth study of polydrug use. So for those of you who don't know, polydrug use can be the sequential or simultaneous consumption of a drug. So simultaneous polydrug use could be mixing heroin and cocaine and injecting them simultaneously, whereas sequential polydrug use could be taking an anxiety pill and then having a glass of wine. And so polydrug use has increasingly been linked to drug poisoning and accidental overdose, and given the skyrocketing number of overdose deaths in the U.S., it's an important contemporary public health issue. So participants in this study were over the age of 18. They had reported injecting illicit drugs within the past month, and they also reported weekly polydrug use, broadly defined as either sequential or simultaneous. They were recruited in 2 cities, first in San Diego from an EPI cohort study of injection drug use, and then second from a harm reduction agency in Philadelphia. And the participant demographics were similar in both cities, although their drug use profiles were a little bit different. So participants in the study, they completed 2 simulations of a cell phone diary. The cell phone diary elicited information using closed-ended questions around mood, drug consumption, drug and sexual-related HIV risk behaviors, and overdose experiences within the previous 12 hours. And then afterwards, the participants completed a semi-structured interview about the content of the diary questions, as well as the hypothetical impact a 1-month mHealth diary study of drug use might have on their lives. For example, we asked questions like, how do you think that completing the diaries might impact your life, which was then followed up with specific probes to elicit information about risks or bad things and benefits or good things. Participants were compensated $30 cash for their time, and then all interviews were audio recorded and transcribed verbatim, and then qualitative analysis involved an iterative process of reviewing the interview transcripts and applying a coding framework reflective of general ethical research principles. So, all participants reported many different types of potential benefits associated with participation. Many felt that answering questions about their daily drug use would positively influence their ability to reflect on their behaviors and provide them with a healthy alternative to their typical daily routine. Further, most indicated that questions were not harmful or to their mental or behavioral states. One of the concerns is that doing these kinds of diaries could trigger drug use. And many of the participants reported that the use of the phone would be a potential economic benefit for providing them a mechanism to either look for a job or stay in contact with their family. So I'm going to review 3 of what I think are the most important benefits. So participants frequently identified reflexivity, or the ability to critically reflect on their lives as a catalyst for changing unwanted behaviors, as an important benefit. So Steve said, and we heard this often, that completing the diary would make me reflect on my day-to-day activities, make it more clear as you're answering the questions where you should be putting in effort to make a change. It's like putting a mirror in front of you. Another important benefit was that folks felt like they were being recognized for their expertise, and you have to keep in mind that this is a population who's frequently stigmatized for the particular expertise that we were lauding. So that was really important. So for Raina, for example, having her expertise recognized vis-a-vis having her recommendations incorporated into study protocol helped her feel good about contributing to science, which could then in turn inspire her to act in other positive ways to feel good. And then altruism was another important social benefit. So participants frequently described the downstream effects of their participation and the possibility it could have a positive impact on others as important. So Eddie's comment here is really characteristic of many that we heard. He said, if what we're doing is going to help, is going to stop someone from getting on or help someone get off heroin, let's do this. I wouldn't wish this on anyone. So we probed 5 types of risks that were identified as important a priori. Before I comment on the types of risks, I'd like to note that when talking about these, most participants considered these risks as not only unlikely to occur, but they also found them to be of little cause for concern. Physical risks were seen as those that could arise from carrying a steady cell phone, such as like being a victim of violence while being robbed. We separated behavioral and psychological risks, we separated them in our coding framework. However, for participants, the outcome of these risks was the same. So the idea that behavioral assessments could potentially trigger adverse reactions. Social risks were those that might arise if law enforcement obtained any information about drug use or other illegal activity. And informational risks were those that arose from unintentional disclosure of drug use or other stigmatized information more broadly. Across all of these types of risks, even with systematic probing, participants identified risks half as much as benefits. So most of our participants, again, they didn't identify with risks personally, but when probed, they could identify circumstances in which someone else, someone who they saw as more vulnerable, could be susceptible to a particular type of risk. So in this quote, Carlos describes how someone who's homeless might be more susceptible to physical risks stemming from theft, as he reflects on his own experience of being robbed while using drugs in public. So he said, it's hard to keep stuff of value when you're using drugs. Some people have it harder than me. When you're living with vandals, you don't have any security. He said, I've woken up, my things have been gone, but he also went on to say, but no one's going to steal from me, or no one's going to beat me up. Similarly, participants voiced concerns for persons suffering from acute depression as being more likely to possibly suffer from any of the psychological harms. So if a participant is constantly being reminded that they're in the bottom of the barrel and feeling depressed, constantly having to go over how they feel, that could make them more anxious and make them want to commit suicide or to overdose, right? Because we were asking them about their mood potentially several times a day. However, despite noting this was a possibility, this participant and most did not consider themselves to be at risk for the psychological harm. And then when asked about what protections researchers could put in place to protect participants, we received a whole host of suggestions, including, who and how to recruit, the types of devices that we should be using, the kinds of service plans that we should be using, the types of payment structures that we could be using. But the most repeated suggestion was to thoroughly describe risks in an informed consent, as well as to obtain and explain the protections that are afforded by a certificate of confidentiality. Interestingly, all of these people had been in studies before and knew, but could not, I think, describe what the benefits are of a certificate of confidentiality. So making sure that people really understand that and know about all of the potential harms, I think, is really critical. So there are some limitations to this study. First and foremost, it's a hypothetical study. We're asking people to, project into the future, to think about what are the potential harms and benefits. And it's also a relatively small sample. But I think that it's important to say that the magnitude of the actual benefits and risks could be smaller or larger. And through other research that I've done, we're now looking to try to understand the mechanisms underlying how people are receiving benefits associated with participation, or how they're experiencing the risks. And so I think that as, we all are conducting research in this realm, it's really important to follow up with people at the end to understand their participation experiences. So in conclusion, I think that our findings indicate that engagement in high-intensity data collection, such as those common to mHealth, that they might confer important benefits such as increased self-awareness and self-efficacy, which is encouraging. While participants, they describe the risks as minimal and unlikely, it remains important for researchers to implement reasonable safeguards to protect human subjects, and that as mHealth becomes more widely used, it will be important to collect data, as I said, in an ongoing fashion about the harms and benefits of actual research. And then, while that we collectively need to work on the development of ethical guidelines for the use of these types of tools in research. And that's definitely something that, I'm open to working on, that Dr. Erin Bonner, who's at Michigan, and I have discussed working on. Abby Rudolph, who's been using GPS stuff. So I think that in this room, there's a great, group of folks who could work on the development of those kinds of guidelines. And that's it. Thank you. These are my references. I'm happy to take questions. And I'm also happy to talk about what I think is going to happen next. So, the first set of findings from this study was just accepted at substance abuse and misuse. And that's a paper, thanks. Yeah, that's a paper that's looking at just the harms. And so we're working on the partner paper, which will look at the benefits. And then beyond that, I'm also working on trying to do an empirical study of benefits associated with a study that was recently completed. So that's it. Yeah.
I have a question about your sample.
Yeah.
And so these were men.
Men and women, but more men than women.
Yeah.
Many more men than women.
So that's what I wanted to, so it seemed like that it's an older group and none of the voices included were women. So there were women that participated. But I wondered sort of about what it raises about sort of and these guys have already participated in other studies.
Sure.
What it raises about the sampling and how we reach the hidden, the even more hidden population.
Sure.
So that, we know, I think injection drug use, the highest prevalence of heroin is among 18 to 30-year-olds. And I think that's and so I'm wondering how we can get at the younger population.
Sure. So,
and I may be misstating that.
I mean, so I think that heroin use, especially in this country, is an evolving epidemic. At least where I live, it's still an older population, but we're seeing that shift, and we're seeing it shift in age and in gender. Yeah. And so
I'm in New Hampshire, Vermont. I know that statistic in our neck of the woods, where the rates of heroin use are so high.
Yeah,
it's younger folks. So.
Yeah, no, I think that is a really important comment. I mean, this is definitely a convenient sample, and using two different methods. One, an epi-cohort study, and in that study, they tried, they tried to get women. They had a whole huge team who was out doing, recruitment in a variety of different settings, and I think it's true across most heroin and injection drug use research that the sample tends to be fairly male. And so, broadly speaking, we may not be doing a good job of getting women into those studies. So as it reflects that research, I think it's pretty on par. Yeah. But, what should we be doing?
Yeah, what do we need to do? That's more my question.
Yeah.
What do we need to do?
We need to make concerted efforts to try and get women into our studies. And I think that, using, an incentivized snowball sample or something like that could reach into these populations. Certainly, I've had success with that with female sex workers and other, crack using populations in the Midwest. Yeah. And so it'll be interesting. I'm about to hopefully launch my first big study in Philly to try and tap into specifically female injection drug users. And so we'll see if going through both the harm reduction agency as well as sex work harm reduction agencies, if that gets us the level of participation that we're interested in seeing.
Yeah. And harm reduction agencies, is that the needle exchange program
Yeah, so that
shooting house, or what does that mean?
So the harm reduction agency in Philly that I was working with, they do HIV care, Hep C testing, substance abuse care, wound care, syringe exchange, naloxone training, Suboxone distribution. So comprehensive harm reduction.
Jared, did you? Yeah. Well, first, just a quick comment. I think in Canada, language is very much women-centered, women-centered care, women-centered this, and so in our organization, because the harm reduction space tends to be very
male.
We have women-only hours in our office. We have female recruitment teams, and it's been a big effort building in the community over time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a similar program that also does the same thing with more youth-friendly, a very tailored approach. So I think some more of the subgroup. My question was around the policing. I was surprised to not see the data there. And when you were describing, all the benefits and that the harms weren't perceived as a big deal, I was immediately thinking, well, what about people who are on parole, or would those people be more concerned about the police finding them with this information? And so, what's your experience been with that? And I don't know if your sample composition had to do with.
No, there were people who were on probation, and so they were worried about it. But for the most part, and I don't know if it's because these are folks who've been in recovery or what, but people didn't really have qualms about disclosing their drug use, and for whatever reason, they trusted that we would keep their data safe. And maybe that had to do with when we showed them, how to enter data, we went through the multiple levels. And so maybe we did a good job of participant education. And also this was a hypothetical study. So I didn't have a certificate of confidentiality. This was just in the future, whatever. So maybe it would be a different perception if these people had been entering their daily data in the community, but it didn't really come up, surprisingly.
I'm working, the social media study I'm doing now, I was just looking at some of the numbers, is predominantly they're older, they're 40s plus.
Yeah.
For the younger population, a lot of them are going through, also we just added medication-assisted treatment sites.
Yeah.
And that's where we're seeing the younger guys, but still mainly guys. They're not going through the traditional intensive outpatient and
Yeah.
outpatient, they're going through.
So it may be through the guys that you're gonna get the women?
Yeah, I
Because
think
that's usually how
Yeah.
women are introduced to injection drug use.
Sure.
Is through the guys.
And the other thing, and to completely agree with you, is that no one is concerned, like, we're not getting concerns about giving up their social media, and we're collecting it from beginning of time, using the data. And we got a certificate of confidentiality, but I was very concerned with the drug using, the population that's using drugs, that it was gonna give them this false sense of security, because they're putting their data on Facebook and on Twitter,
Yeah.
which is not protected, and the police could get it, and, and everything. So we actually explained, we have a certificate of confidentiality, but it's only protecting the research data, like these questions I'm asking, and
Huh.
not protecting any of that. It was very clear with them in explaining, and we put in the consent form, too, like, like, you're not getting off free here.